Despite stated intentions and implemented sanctions, data indicates a notable increase in gas imports to the European Union from Russia during 2024. A report by the think tank Ember documents this rise, specifying an 18% increase compared to the import volumes of 2023. This figure encompasses both pipeline gas and liquefied natural gas, or LNG. This development occurs against the backdrop of EU-imposed sanctions on various Russian energy sources, initiated following the commencement of hostilities in Ukraine in February 2022. While the EU publicly aims to cease Russian gas imports by 2027, this objective is not currently legally binding, a crucial distinction. Further complicating the situation, Ukraine ceased allowing Russian gas transit through its pipeline network at the start of 2024. Despite this transit cessation, the overall volume of Russian gas entering the EU has demonstrably increased. Certain member states are identified as key drivers of this import surge. Italy, the Czech Republic, and France are specifically highlighted as leading contributors to the increased intake of Russian gas. This situation has drawn scrutiny and criticism, notably from the EU Energy Commissioner. The Commissioner has publicly labeled the continued gas imports from Russia as unsustainable, directly linking these imports to the financial support of ongoing military actions. The question that arises is therefore clear. What factors are driving this increase in Russian gas imports into the EU despite stated policy and geopolitical tensions, and what are the broader implications of this trend? To understand this apparent contradiction, several factors must be considered. One primary element involves the nature of the sanctions themselves. While the EU imposed restrictions on Russian coal and oil, the sanctions regime permits the continued import of Russian liquefied natural gas. This allowance creates a significant pathway for Russian gas to reach European markets, bypassing pipeline transit limitations through Ukraine. As a direct consequence, Russian LNG exports to the EU have become a crucial and growing component of the overall energy import picture. Furthermore, economic considerations within specific EU member states likely play a significant role. Despite the collective political stance against Russia, individual nations may prioritize securing energy supplies at competitive prices. Italy, the Czech Republic, and France, identified as leading importers, may be driven by domestic energy demands or pre-existing contractual obligations that are more economically advantageous to fulfill with Russian gas, at least in the short term. This economic imperative can override broader geopolitical objectives, leading to a divergence between stated EU policy and the actual import behavior of its members. The Ember think tank's analysis adds another layer to this complexity. Their report highlights that this increase in Russian gas imports is occurring despite stagnant overall gas demand within the EU. This raises questions about the necessity of these increased imports. If demand is not rising, the import surge suggests potential overstockpiling, or perhaps that Russian gas, even with geopolitical premiums, remains economically attractive compared to readily available alternatives for certain member states. Ember's criticism of investments in LNG infrastructure further suggests a potential misallocation of resources, where expenditure on new import capacity may be incentivizing LNG intake, even if fundamentally unnecessary for meeting current demand. Moreover, the reliance on alternative gas suppliers, while intended to diversify away from Russia, presents its own set of challenges. Ember's report points to increased geopolitical tensions with the United States, a major LNG exporter to the EU, as a source of potential instability. Therefore, simply replacing Russian gas with gas from other sources does not automatically guarantee long-term energy security. It merely shifts the geopolitical dependency, potentially creating new vulnerabilities. This suggests that a more comprehensive energy strategy is required, one that moves beyond simply changing suppliers and focuses on fundamental shifts in energy consumption and production within the EU itself. However, a contrasting viewpoint might emphasize the immediate practicalities faced by EU member states. While the long-term strategic goal of energy independence from Russia is acknowledged, the short-term imperative to secure sufficient and affordable energy supplies remains paramount for national economies and social stability. From this perspective, the increase in Russian gas imports, particularly LNG, could be interpreted not as a policy failure, but as a pragmatic adaptation to current market conditions and available options. It could be argued that for Italy, the Czech Republic, and France, Russian gas, even with its geopolitical baggage, represents a readily accessible and potentially price-competitive energy source compared to alternatives in the immediate timeframe. This perspective might prioritize ensuring uninterrupted energy flow to industries and consumers, even if it means continued or even increased reliance on Russian supplies in the interim. Furthermore, proponents of this view could assert that the EU sanctions, while targeting specific energy sectors, were intentionally designed to avoid a complete disruption of gas flows. The continued allowance of Russian LNG imports might be seen as a deliberate compromise, balancing the need to exert pressure on Russia with the equally pressing need to maintain European energy security. In this interpretation, the EU's energy policy is not necessarily contradictory, but rather reflects a complex balancing act between competing geopolitical, economic, and social priorities. The criticism from the EU Energy Commissioner, while highlighting the ethical and strategic concerns of funding Russia's war effort, might be perceived by some member states as being detached from the immediate energy security challenges they face domestically. This divergence of perspectives underscores the inherent tensions within the EU's energy policy, a tension between aspirational long-term goals and the often unyielding realities of short-term energy needs and market dynamics. However, a deeper examination reveals potential long-term strategic vulnerabilities inherent in this situation. The continued reliance on Russian gas, even in LNG form, prolongs a dependency that undermines the EU's stated goal of energy independence and reduces its geopolitical leverage. Financially, these ongoing imports, as highlighted by the EU Commissioner, directly contribute revenue to the Russian state, enabling its military actions and potentially prolonging the conflict in Ukraine. This financial flow creates a strategic contradiction. The EU aims to weaken Russia through sanctions, yet simultaneously funds it through energy purchases. Furthermore, the increased import of Russian gas, particularly if driven by short-term economic considerations, may disincentivize investments in genuine, long-term energy alternatives. As Ember suggests, resources directed towards LNG infrastructure, even if sourced from diverse locations, may detract from investments in renewable energy sources and energy efficiency measures that offer a more sustainable and geopolitically secure energy future for the EU. This short-sighted approach risks locking the EU into continued fossil fuel dependence, irrespective of the supplier, and hindering the transition to a more resilient and autonomous energy system. The long-term implications extend beyond energy security and geopolitical strategy. The apparent inconsistency between the EU's political stance on Russia and its operational energy procurement practices damages the EU's credibility on the international stage. This perceived contradiction can be interpreted as a lack of strategic coherence and resolve, potentially weakening the EU's influence in international affairs and undermining its broader foreign policy objectives. Ultimately, the increased import of Russian gas in 2024, while potentially explainable by short-term economic or practical considerations, reveals a deeper systemic challenge within the EU's energy policy framework, a difficulty in translating long-term strategic goals into consistent operational actions, and a persistent vulnerability to external energy dependencies, regardless of their origin. Examining the broader implications, this situation reveals a potential weakening of the EU's overall geopolitical posture. Continued gas imports from Russia, especially amidst ongoing conflict, demonstrably reduce the EU's capacity to exert meaningful pressure on Moscow. Energy dependence, even if partially shifted to LNG, translates directly into diminished leverage in diplomatic and strategic engagements. The financial dimension of this energy trade carries significant broader consequences. The revenue stream generated by these gas sales directly bolsters the Russian economy and, as the EU Commissioner explicitly stated, indirectly finances Russia's military operations. This financial contribution undermines the intended impact of other sanctions and creates a paradoxical situation where the EU, while aiming to isolate Russia, simultaneously provides it with substantial economic support. Looking beyond the immediate crisis, this reliance on external gas supplies, even from seemingly more stable sources, perpetuates a long-term vulnerability for the EU. While diversification away from Russian pipeline gas may appear to enhance security, dependence on LNG, regardless of origin, still leaves the EU exposed to global market fluctuations, geopolitical shifts affecting supplier nations, and potential disruptions to maritime trade routes. True energy security, in a broader strategic sense, necessitates a fundamental shift towards domestically controlled and sustainable energy sources, a transition that may be delayed or undermined by continued reliance on imported gas, irrespective of its origin. Finally, the apparent contradiction between the EU's stated policy of reducing Russian energy dependence and the documented increase in gas imports has a broader impact on the EU's standing on the world stage. This inconsistency can be perceived as a lack of strategic resolve and policy coherence, potentially eroding trust in the EU's pronouncements and weakening its ability to act as a unified and credible geopolitical actor. The operational reality of increased Russian gas imports, therefore, extends far beyond immediate energy balances, impacting the EU's geopolitical influence, financial strategy towards Russia, long-term energy security, and international credibility. This necessitates a critical reevaluation of the EU's energy policy framework and its implementation to ensure alignment between stated objectives and concrete actions. Ultimately, the increased import of Russian gas into the European Union in 2024 serves as a stark indicator of a fundamental strategic misalignment. It reveals a critical gap between stated political objectives and operational realities within EU energy policy. This situation is not merely an energy security issue. It is a multifaceted challenge that encompasses geopolitical strategy, financial probity, long-term sustainability, and the very credibility of the European Union as a coherent international actor. The data demonstrably illustrates that despite declared intentions and implemented sanctions, the flow of Russian gas has not only continued but has, in fact, increased. This operational reality compels a critical reassessment. It necessitates a move beyond short-term, economically expedient solutions towards a genuinely integrated and strategically consistent energy policy framework. Without such a fundamental reevaluation, the EU risks perpetuating a cycle of dependence, undermining its own geopolitical leverage, and inadvertently financing the very forces it seeks to counter. The continued reliance on Russian gas, therefore, represents not a stable solution, but a strategically unsustainable paradox that demands decisive and coherent action to resolve. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, and be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more geopolitical insights like this. I love hearing your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Share this video with anyone interested in deeper perspectives on current events. Until next time, stay informed and think critically. Thank you.